Evolution FM. Uplift yourself to uplift others. It's time to evolve. The nervous system is the lens through which you experience the world. This quote hit me like a ton of bricks, and it is from this episode with one of my newer friends, Jonny Miller. Jonny is the founder of Nervous System Mastery. He's a somatic expert. He also hosts an amazing podcast called Curious Humans. And for me, I have been fascinated by the nervous system even before I got into consciousness and spirituality. And as I've gone deeper down this path, I've started to notice an increasing linkage between nervous system function and consciousness evolution. And I have to say, I have encountered a lot of misinformation out there. There was a lot of things that I was doing in terms of breath work and somatic experiences that it wasn't that they were wrong. It's just that they were missing pivotal parts of the process for my nervous system to heal and more harmoniously deal with all types of emotions and the world. And these oversights really just made it uncomfortable to be in my body for years. And if you're uncomfortable in your body, you're not going to be in as good a mood. You're not going to be as loving. You're not going to be as excited about doing whatever it is you're doing, which is why the quote at the beginning of the episode really stuck with me. I think this episode is amazing because Jonny knows more about the nervous system than anybody that I've ever encountered. And there's so much nuance in this work and somatic practice that really understanding these things in a nuanced way can create big unlocks in your personal growth and your nervous system health. And so we get into some of these things that I wish I would have known years earlier. Things like concentration is actually different than relaxing when you're experiencing a sensation in your body, or the importance of a 30-minute period of total relaxation so that the body can integrate any type of big energetic releases and repattern in a way that actually maintains that change and positive state moving forward. And so there's lots of little nuggets in this episode. And guess what? Jonny's also got an amazing British accent. So I think this is a really good one. And for anybody out there that is interested in learning more, Jonny has a whole program on this called Nervous System Mastery, which I cannot recommend enough. You can check it out in the episode show links, but let's just get into it and hear what Jonny has to say about the nervous system and somatics. Jonny, what's up, man?
It's great to be here, Scott.
It's great to have you here, man. I have been voraciously consuming your content and frankly, having many ahas in my own experience about my own body, my own nervous system. And, the nervous system to me it's just one of the most fascinating topics. And maybe just to kind of frame things up, when did all of this become a passion for you?
Yeah, good question. I think I've always been interested in the question of what does it mean to live well? And I think in my early years, I approached that very, very intellectually and philosophically, kind of studied philosophy at university and, read Plato and Aristotle and these kinds of things. But I think that the nervous system stuff specifically, for me, it came through loss and it came through the journey of grief, essentially, and realizing through that how disconnected I'd been from my body and how I'd been kind of numb from the neck down. I don't know if that resonates at all.
Immensely.
Yeah, right. Me too. I came from, had a startup for 5 years, was kind of a very, very heady kid, I think. And for me, that the journey through the different modalities and experiences that I've had, the nervous system seemed to be the unifying thread in many ways. It's it all seemed to come back to that in some way. And it became a lens through which I started to understand my own experience and also learn about like what the hell is going on when we're having these altered states of consciousness or experiencing intense emotions or depression, all these things. So it's just become a really powerful lens that I've started to try and understand the human experience, I guess.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because, I myself, was an athlete, was very into working out and my body and eating. And it wasn't really until after I did psychedelics that I actually started to feel the subtle parts of my body.
Hmm.
It was actually like I could feel what was going on inside. And it's funny, I was just having a conversation about how it's kind of like going through like feeling or energetic puberty where you have all of these unfamiliar sensations.
Yeah.
And at first, it can be kind of alarming and scary. And I don't know if you had that experience, but it's just very interesting that you can kind of go through your whole life being numb and not even knowing it. And
Yeah.
there's this whole world of experience that awaits you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that does resonate a lot. And for me, I think there've almost been specific emotions that I was resisting or afraid to feel until, the last 5 years or so. And I remember the first time that I like really expressed anger and rage this was in a breathwork journey, or like learning to feel the sensations that come with shame. For me, it's like this like swampy feeling down in my hips and my pelvis, as opposed to just like the stories that used to come online. And so I kind of see it as like exploring this inner landscape, or like I don't know if you played Zelda, but like as you start
Oh,
to
yeah.
move around the territory, I've just bought a Switch, so I'm like ready to dive back in. But
Ocarina of Time.
yeah, I love that game, and it's like more of the territory opens up. It's been like this adventure really of like finding not only new subtleties, but like new sensations, finding out where I've chronically held tension in parts of my body that I, wasn't even aware of until these experiences.
I resonate with the anger thing. I think we're programmed from a society perspective that to be angry is to kind of be uncivilized or to be inappropriate. And it's fascinating. And, the repression of all these things can just manifest in immense physical health problems. And we can talk more about that. But maybe more fundamentally, what is your understanding as someone who has, spent a lot of time in the science and research of how does the nervous system connect to emotion?
That's a great question. So there's one kind of theory of emotion by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she talks about how emotion is essentially just sensation plus context, or sensation plus story. I like to focus on the sensation side of things, which is, very connected to the nervous system. And all humans have what's known as a window of tolerance. So this is like the window in which we feel safe, we're comfortable, we're regulated, we can have conversations like this. We can go outside of that window. When we go outside in the kind of what's known as the sympathetic side, like the overwhelm, then we experience anxiety, maybe frustration, maybe rage. It's like the intense reactivity side of things. And then on the other end of the window is known as dorsal, and that's where we go into like collapse. So it can be, shame, depression, deep lethargy, withdrawal. The art of working with our nervous systems is both staying in that window of tolerance, being aware when we're out of it, knowing how to come back in, and over time expanding the window, essentially, which is our capacity and our resilience in life.
It's really fascinating. And one of the things I heard you said that I thought was very interesting is when we don't allow these emotions to complete, effectively, it's kind of like they get stored. They get stored in, it's actually, people love to cite the body keeps the score, but it's actually not in the tissues. It's in the brain, correct?
It's so the memories are stored in the lower brainstem, which basically has what's known as a cortical map of the entire body. So it can seem as if you have, anger stored in your shoulders or grief stored in your hips, but the actual the limbic memories are stored in the lower brainstem. But what you mentioned about completing these emotions, I think that might be worth unpacking for listeners, because it was, it's certainly new to me when I first came across it. And it's this idea that completing emotions, this was new when I first came across it. And it's this idea that we have these incomplete reflexes in our body, ever since early childhood, even like pre-verbal, the first 3 years of life. And there are times when we went through some kind of experience and the body wasn't able to respond or in kind of move through that mobilization charge. And so it gets stored as like an incomplete reflex. And over time, if we have enough of these reflexes, it causes what I call emotional debt, or essentially fragility in the nervous system. And this can be as simple as like when a need wasn't met, or when we wanted to defend ourselves but we weren't able to, or when we froze in a certain situation, or even things like surgeries. Like when people go under general anesthetic, there are things that the body would do if it was able to that kind of get stuck. And so in the context of things like breathwork journeys, I've seen people relive like drowning experiences or sexual assaults or surgeries. But it's the body's way of completing these experiences that it wasn't able to previously.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating. Like you see people that are hunched over, or you see people that are out of alignment, or whatever it is, and it's just amazing how that actually is just kind of a reaction to an experience that never completed. In my own experience, one of the things that I've been thinking about is it feels like I've been on this consciousness journey where the consciousness in the head and the mind has almost evolved faster than the body. And now my body and my gut is like rapidly like undoing knots, and like lots of physical pain. And so, yeah, I'd be curious to get your perspective on like, this just massive unwinding process that often goes in conjunction with the expansion of consciousness and the somatic work and all of these things.
So the way that I think about it is our sense of like embodied safety kind of dictates whatever is ready to be surfaced to unwind. So if we imagine the image of like a clenched fist, and we imagine there are these like clenched fists all over our body that have been accumulating over time, as we begin to, let's say, like expand our awareness and also feel safe in our environment, safe in our body, we have our basic needs met, then these clenched fists, these incomplete reflexes begin to surface almost like layers of an onion. I think of it like when one completes, then the next one will kind of arise. And that often does happen almost in a top-down way. And in my experience, a lot of the more deeply held kind of foundational clenchings do seem to be in the gut and like the pelvic floor area. And there's also, there's no predicting what will come up. And I liked what you said earlier around like, if you see someone who's hunched over or whatever that is, you can often tell, or at least my teacher, Ed Dangerfield, he was almost like Sherlock Holmes in that he could see someone, he could, judging by their posture, their breath, their tone of voice, he could basically tell like what type of childhood experiences that person had had based on how they were showing up in that way. And based on that, he was then able to, do certain facilitations or give certain verbal cues that would elicit that like incomplete reflex. And it's fascinating. I'm learning this myself, but it's such a, when you see it done in real time, it's like magic.
That's amazing. Can we talk about, I heard you tell a story of like someone losing their laugh, which honestly I resonate with. And I think the listeners would find this just very exemplary of like the type of impact that this can have.
Yeah. So this was after one of my first plant medicine ceremonies, and I had this very profound kind of healing experience. And at the end of it, I felt this like grounded, like warrior belly laugh that just erupted through me. And it completely took me by surprise. And I was, fully sober at this point. We were kind of sitting around the fire. It was so beautiful, honestly. And I ended up writing a short story that I called "The Boy Who Lost His Laugh and Journeyed into His Belly to Find It." I'd love to publish it one day as a little children's story, but I think it is illustrative of the depth of our laugh is almost a mirror for how much tension we're holding in our lower and upper diaphragm. So we actually have 3 diaphragms in the body. There's the one around the rib cage, and then there's the diaphragm around the pelvic floor, and then there's the diaphragm of the throat. And the more tension we're chronically holding, generally the higher pitched the laugh is. And, you can hear it in people's voices as well. I mean, I think that if I listen to my early podcast episodes 3 years ago, I think my voice sounds different today than it did back then. And I think that's because there is just less lower diaphragm tension that's in my body.
My first ayahuasca experience, my intention was to reconnect with my childlike joy. Classic, 4 years into my startup, stressed out as all hell, just like kind of a miserable human. And dude, I laughed my ass off for like 30 minutes. And years before that, I had almost became one of these people that hissed, like I would like gyrate, but not laugh with sound, if that makes sense. And
yeah, it does.
and it's almost like I just like thought that's how I laughed. And like, I didn't really understand that I had lost my capacity to belly laugh due to effectively probably lots of imprinting, like lots of experiences of basically being restricted, trying to be the nice guy, trying to be polite, trying to like keep my place, like all of these type of programming that we're subject to and don't even know it. I mean, it was just so freaking profound. And that expanded laugh persisted and then went away. And now it's coming back as have been having lots of somatic experiences over the past couple of years. But it really is pretty wild, man. I
feel like goosebumps hearing you say that because it really resonates with my journey as well. And like, what a fantastic like fucking metric for like,
dude.
how much like inner work you're doing. Like, how deep is your laugh? I love that. And you can tell when someone has this like, it's almost like an authentic roar. They're not holding back, and they're not impacted by what other people might think. And I just think it's beautiful.
It's funny. I was thinking about Mark Manson's book, like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. I'm like, yeah, well, you kind of got to like do a lot of work somatically and on your consciousness to truly, have that freedom.
Yeah.
I think that's like, it's like, why are we even talking about this? Like, why is this work even relevant? It's really just about freedom, man. And part of freedom is being safe to just be whoever the frick you want to be, in a given moment.
Yeah.
And so, it's so exciting to me that we have access to these tools. And I want to kind of change gears a little bit in terms of, people that are listening, they might be seeing a little bit of themselves in these stories. They might acknowledge that like, wow, I actually have some stuff going on with my body and some creaks and some hinges. And what is the mechanism for which the body starts to move into a healing state? What are the practices that you do and work with people on and teach?
Yeah, beautiful question. I think first I want to just touch on the freedom piece because I think it's so crucial. And there's a beautiful quote by Gurdjieff. He basically says, before you're able to escape prison, you first have to realize that you're behind bars. And it's this idea that like we don't even realize the prisons that we've created or that we're living in. It's like the water that we're swimming in. And that was me for 25 years. I'm sure it was you as well for a period of time. And so I think the first piece is really that like somatic self-awareness and
yes.
Getting curious about this being, this body, and the experiences that have shaped it. So in terms of how people come to the healing path, part of me wishes this wasn't true, but I think most of the time it's through some form of crisis or heartbreak. Like it's usually a health crisis, startup goes under, or you lose someone that you love, a breakup. It's one of these moments where your current way of being gets shattered in some way. And there's like an opening in that. And some people, many people I think do unfortunately get stuck there. They get stuck in like the tragic. And if you're fortunate enough to discover one of these somatic-based modalities, or maybe it's plant medicine, maybe it's breath work, maybe it's forms of somatic meditation, then it's a beautiful opening and it's almost a gift. And it allows you to surface these, deeply held, sometimes emotional memories, sometimes it's just in the body, and they surface to be completed. And for me, maybe it'd be helpful to share a bit of my experience with this. I lost my fiance. This was about 5.5 years ago. She was a doctor and she had bipolar. And one day when I was away, she had an anxiety attack at work and she came home and overdosed on a medication and she took her own life. And pretty much up until that point, I'd had a pretty easy ride. Like I'd had a decent education. I had like no big challenges in my life. And this just completely like shattered my world. I mean, it really kind of broke who I thought I was going to be at that time. I remember seeing adults and seeing particularly older people who'd lost loved ones but felt like they hadn't grieved. And there was something that was almost like dead. It was almost like a shell of a human in some ways. And I remember seeing one man in particular and just being so afraid of becoming that I think I kind of turned in the opposite direction and kind of went fully. I was like, I'm gonna fucking feel this grief so hard, like classic, like young macho, like I'm just gonna feel this shit. And that kind of sent me on a road through initially Vipassana meditation, and from there then freediving and breathwork experiences, many plant medicine ceremonies, and that was really my initiation of sorts. But I think for people listening who are maybe wondering about how to approach this, and maybe they have a sense that there's things that are stored in them that they're not fully aware of, I would essentially recommend trauma aware, ideally one-on-one somatic based therapy. And that can look like somatic experiencing, it can look like conscious connected breath work. There's plant medicine done in a kind of responsible container with appropriate setting. There's many different ways in, but essentially it's like you have to find a way in to create some kind of generally altered state in the body where these subconscious pieces can arise, and then welcome them in without trying to change them, fix them, push them away. Like there needs to be this genuine sense of like welcoming present.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And I deeply resonate with your, kind of like that intense doer paradigm of once you discover this stuff of, okay, I'm going to be the best somatic releaser ever. And I'm going to somatic release my freaking ass off. And I got to tell you, man, I like blew out my nervous system, which has still been something I've been recovering with. And, just years of physical discomfort because I overextended myself outside of my window of tolerance, which I think people don't talk about the implications of like going too hard on your nervous system with this stuff and applying that type of intensity and determination to the inner work. And it's my experience that we can really overload our nervous systems with, trying to treat these type of practices like you would be training for a marathon, for example, versus just really learning to listen to your body and treat your kind of like awareness, awakening, healing journey, whatever you want to call it, with grace and ease. And so I don't know if you've encountered that a lot with any of your clients or anything, but for me, it's been a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of like not being able to touch certain types of substances, like all types of crazy sensitivities because the nervous system has just been out of whack.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm really glad you brought this up. And it's something that I actually feel pretty passionate about. So I was also, I think, like gung-ho in the beginning of my journey. Yeah. And I remember I had like my first one-on-one session with Ed, who became my breathwork teacher and mentor. And he doesn't really mince words, and he basically diagnosed me with an overachiever breathwork pattern. He was like classic type A overachiever, like big inflated upper chest, holding at the top, and like really challenged exhale was basically like my breathing pattern that really took me years to work through. And I mean, there's so much that can be said here, but for me, a lot of the work wasn't like accessing these altered states because that was easy for me. I could just breathe intensely and have these profound experiences. But it wasn't actually serving me because, as you said, I was just overloading my nervous system. And the real work was actually training what's known as the ventral break in polyvagal theory, which is basically, it's like our capacity to relax into safety. I've been working on like really having a completely effortless exhale is how it shows up in the context of breathwork, with no holding at the top, and the neck or the kind of top diaphragm also correlates to holding down in the belly and the lower diaphragm. Why this is really relevant, I think, is because so many forms of breathwork, in particular Wim Hof, certain forms of holotropic breathwork, they're basically, getting 200-300 people in a room, blasting music, banging drums, and getting people to hyperventilate. And people have powerful experiences, but as you say, it's really not serving their nervous systems. And I know people who've been re-traumatized, people who've been sent into pretty intense dysregulation for months and sometimes years. And these risks really aren't being talked about. And I think the antidote is, it's maybe less sexy, it maybe doesn't look as good on Instagram, but it's essentially learning how to be regulated. It's learning how to exhale. It's learning how to surrender and let go. And this is also for me where a lot of the richness and the most profound experiences have come from states of like deep surrender, where it almost looks as if I've stopped breathing. In fact, sometimes there is this spontaneous like breath retention that I'm not doing, it just happens. And that's where the most profound and healing experiences have been. But you can't effort your way there. And I think that's the fundamental like unlearning that needs to happen, is we've been conditioned for doing, for trying, for pushing. Like that's how we've been rewarded. That will get you to a certain place, and it's beautiful to go in with courage and to have the intention to feel things. But at the same time, it ultimately has to be let go of. And at a certain point, if you push too hard, it becomes very just challenging, and it can really mess up people's nervous systems, as you said.
I couldn't agree more. And I think there's like a couple of really important things that I've observed. And so one, I think there was, for me in my own experience, the ego loves progress.
Mm-hmm.
It loves to feel like it's improving. And there was this imprint and thought form of, if I shake, I'm letting go of stuff. Stuff is being shaken out of me and I'm growing and I'm getting rid of it. And it took me a long time to realize that the actual healing occurs in rest. You see on Instagram, like somatic breathwork and people like gyrating and it's like, it kind of is like, that's not where all the healing occurs. And I didn't realize this for a long time. And I had this basically false association of what an effective practice looked like. And it caused me to just basically overload myself and think that I was actually doing myself a favor. And I think you're exactly right that there's a lot of not telling the whole story of these practices that it's being advertised out there. The second thing that I realized rather recently, there was a mistaken, kind of a misconstruence of concentration and relaxation. What that looks like is I would feel a sensation in my body somatically, either induced or just because I had a still mind. And I would shift my focus to that. And it was almost like there was this intensity of focus on that because that was what I thought would allow that to unwind. And there was the concentration and thoughtless focus on the thing without the ability to truly allow, like be more allowing, right? Like it was almost like a hypervigilance of concentration that was actually blocking the healing. One of the things I appreciate a lot about what you talk about is there really is just so many subtleties with this work to really arrive at, I would say, like sustainable and effective healing, even within something that's, just as easy as breathing, right? Like there's lots of nuance for the practices to actually, really serve the nervous system.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And the way that I think about it is often the thing that's healing is generally feeling the thing that we don't want to feel. So many people will have their like default emotional responses, and usually people are comfortable in either sadness or anger. There's kind of a rule of thumb. And so some people's default might be like you, just to kind of like shake things and feel like that's making progress. But the kind of the radical move is the softening, the allowing, and the like surrendering into the deeper peace. For other people, kind of sadness and softness might be easy, but actually the shaking or maybe even anger might be their edge. Like that might be the place for them to go that unlocks something new. And this is why, having a teacher who can see when you might be what's known as either flooding or emotionally looping, and to kind of like give you constructive feedback. Because otherwise we can be in these emotional loops and fool ourselves that we're making progress when really we're just like reaffirming the same grooves that we've been locked in for most of our lives.
One thing that I heard that was really interesting is there's this advice about anger specifically. I was reading this book of, like you should let your anger out, like go punch a pillow, go into the woods and chop wood and scream and like let all that anger out. And what this person was talking about is, I'm sure there are some potential contexts and benefits where that makes sense, but that can also serve as a rehearsal. And I think when I heard you talking about kind of like some of these loops, it's like a lot of times we think we might be releasing and we're rehearsing. And that actually is just maintaining or deepening the groove, as you put it, which is, just can be tricky. It can be really, really tricky.
Yeah. So to kind of dive into anger specifically, I like to have the metaphor or the image of like a hose. So like emotion is like energy in motion. It's running down a hose, and the hose can be kinked, usually in one of two ways. It can be kinked so that it's repressed. And in the case of anger, this is like passive aggressive behavior. It's like, I'm not angry, you're angry. It's like the classic kind of like someone pushing it down. Or the other end, which looks like, it might be the person going to the woods in rage, and you can be angry at someone. You can be, in rage, but still not really feeling the anger itself. The rage can be a way of kinked in the other way to avoid feeling the actual energy of anger. And often, not this isn't always the case, but often beneath anger is like protecting something. And there's usually some kind of hurt or heartbreak that is underneath the anger, which we are like deeply afraid to feel into. At least that's been my experience.
That's been my experience as well. I know you lost your fiance. I lost my dad to suicide. And I was basically afraid to be angry about it because I thought that would make me a bad son. My mom, I thought, needed me to kind of be the man of the house and the stoic one. And, I was the spiritual person, and like everything happens for a reason. And my dad's eternal and all this stuff. And basically there were all these kind of unconscious rationalizations of why I couldn't be angry. And yeah, man, I got to say, like, once I finally allowed myself to feel anger and recognize that it was essentially suppressed, thanks to the work of John Sarno, who has a great book called Healing Back Pain.
That's fantastic.
There was just like mountains of rage that, like, I didn't end up like expressing them, like yelling, but they were just witnessed. It's like you witness the energy, and like sometimes that can be accompanied by, thoughts that are like, fuck you, like all this like type of stuff. But like, I think it's an important nuance for people to realize that like experiencing and acknowledging the emotion doesn't necessarily mean that you're projecting it. And so there was like lots of that. And then underneath all that was this like immense reservoir of sadness that didn't know that it was there also. And so it's really fascinating. And, the reason why this stuff gets suppressed, if you, at least theoretically from people like John Sarno, is we have this survival mechanism that says if you act out your rage, you will potentially put yourself in harm, right? What are we going to do? We're going to hide it. We're going to tuck it away and not make it readily available to you so that you have a higher chance of survival.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I've worked with a number of breathwork clients, and particularly in men, actually. Like I've seen that, I'm not saying this is always the case, but men who've come depressed with, very low sex drive, very low like motivation and will, going into and like feeling healthy anger, and like you said, not only expressing it but actually feeling into the sensations associated and the emotional content there, it really unlocks this life force for them. I mean, I saw this in my life. You mentioned earlier that I think this was maybe before we hit record, but feeling like you were like a nice guy, like maybe people pleasing, not setting great boundaries, like that was entirely me as well. I came to understand the difference between being nice versus being kind, and how being kind, it means that you have a healthy relationship with anger, which is essentially the capacity to say no and to set healthy boundaries and to protect that you love, to kind of stand for your principles. It's that like warrior archetype that is how I think of it. And I've seen in less than a week, someone who has been pretty depressed just turn around and have this like aliveness come back online. And I really do think it is connected to there's many different ways in which repressed emotions can show up, but I think that's a particularly prevalent pattern, particularly I think in young men who learnt that at some point it wasn't okay to be angry, or they would have had to sacrifice their love and belonging in order to express the anger, and will always choose connection over authenticity, especially when we're kids.
I think it's just really unfortunate that right now we seem to be living in a culture that is promoting more censorship, more restriction, more inability to express yourselves freely. And I agree, man. I had the same exact revelation of like, there's a difference between being a good person and being a loving person, or being a kind person. And one of the biggest differences is that being a kind person or being a loving person means that you love yourself, and you love yourself enough to maintain boundaries, do things like say no, say what you really fucking think, like all of the things that are emblematic of love, which also can incorporate, things like mutual respect for others. And I don't worry. It just is what it is. But like, I think the direction of lots of kind of ways of being in our society and the way that our culture is going, I do think there's going to be a pretty big backlash for people's health with just the emotional regulation that is currently required to avoid being canceled or to just be accepted or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, I think we're already starting to see it to some degree with the increase in mental health, like disorders, suicide rates, all these things. I mean, whilst the world is supposedly getting richer and healthier in some metrics, like the amount of addiction and depression and just I think it comes back to lack of connection for me. It's like lack of connection to self and connection to others. And I mean, I think you're right. I think we're in for a really challenging decade ahead. And that's why I think, these practices that we've been talking about, whether it's breath work or forms of somatic exploration, they are essential if people are going to survive, like, or completely lose their minds.
Totally. I completely agree. What does that look like for you? Like, what does this going mainstream look like? Because right now, this is kind of how I feel, and I'd love to hear how you feel. I basically am feeling somatic stuff all day, and I love it. And it's a huge part of my life. I mean, it's my primary purpose is my evolution, which, makes me more loving, makes me a better fiance, a better son, a better everything. And so it's the number one thing. And yet I feel like people kind of are like tourists of this stuff. Many who are not, like, you do a breathwork class, you're like, oh, that was cool, but that's kind of it. And you got to pay for it out of pocket. And, there's not a lot of teachers. It's like, what does normalization of somatic work look and feel like to you?
It's challenging. I think the things that I'm drawn to are the practices which are self-empowering. Like there are certain things you can do, maybe even going to the jungle to take plant medicine, where people are externalizing their capacity to heal to someone else. They're basically giving away their power to the teacher, the facilitator, the therapist, whoever it is. And I think that in order for this to truly stick, that power has to be given back to the individual. And yes, it's amazing to have guides, teachers, mentors, but ultimately it's that essence of self-responsibility that I think is key. The question of how will this go mainstream, I think is a very good one. I've been thinking about what I teach with the nervous system mastery course. There's almost this like Trojan horse approach where it's framed as, cultivating calm, cultivating resilience, being more productive potentially if you're, well regulated. I think there's a certain degree that you have to frame these practices through the lens that people are already seeing the world or seeing their life through. Yeah, and that's why I feel conflicted about, things like Wim Hof or holotropic breathwork. Like, it's definitely getting more media attention, which is great. And the shadow side is the way that it's being shared and practiced is in some cases causing even more dysregulation. And so what I'd love to see is some form of like nervous system literacy that is just, ultimately included in school educations. I think that's where it has to begin. But just have this stuff taken, particularly things like polyvagal theory, that I think is just foundational knowledge for any human being, really, and have that be part of mainstream conversation in the way that meditation, 20 years ago, it was fairly obscure. And now there's thousands of research papers that have been published. So in terms of what that path is, I don't know, but I'm hopeful that a combination of, just skillful trauma-aware practitioners who understands nuance, plus, maybe it's a Netflix documentary or like, I don't know what that path looks like, but it feels like it needs to happen. And it's certainly what I'm passionate about. It's what I'm spending most of my time thinking about.
I love your idea of somatic literacy. I mean, the nervous system, the way that I think about it is really like the governor of like everything else. Everything works because of the nervous system. And if the nervous system doesn't work, then you're in trouble. And yet we don't really teach people how to take care of that root cause or that root governor. One thing I think is very interesting that I love your opinion on, that's kind of more of a selfish personal question, is I notice into the ocean, I start to induce a spontaneous somatic response often.
Mm.
And I don't know if that's something that you've heard about before or you've exhibited in your own experience, but I think it's really interesting.
Okay, so two things. Firstly, on the nervous system piece, not only is it the governor, but I think it's also helpful to understand that it's literally the lens through which we are experiencing life. Like, when we're in that sympathetic overwhelm, we are seeing the world through that filter of anxiety or rage, like the thoughts that we have, the things that we're paying attention to, and the same when we're in dorsal shutdown. And so it's not only governing our physiological responses, but it's literally shifting what we're perceiving in any given moment. So I think that's also like a crucial just piece that I wanted to emphasize.
That's right.
In terms of the somatic experience, and like, how would you describe this? What type of somatic experience do you feel?
I start to feel an energy and my body starts shaking. It starts rattling. Yeah, it's really interesting. Humans are primarily composed of water. That's not lost on me, but was just, wondering if you knew anything, had any hypotheses about that.
That's interesting. I mean, I've been a surfer for 12, 13 years. And for me, I feel safest and most at home when I'm particularly in the ocean or in a large body of water. Do you experience this when it's like in a bath?
Yeah, I'll experience it in a shower. Like, I'll take a shower and it's like, if I have a still mind, like my second ayahuasca retreat, I had like basically a Kundalini awakening. And every single time I like quieted my mind after that, it was like my body just started shaking. It was like energy overload for years. I mean, it still happens. And if I like go into the shower with a still mind, it's like my body just starts like, it's like a rattle. It's like I'm in a part of a mariachi band or something.
Yeah. My guess or how I would begin to frame this so if I'm guiding someone through a breathwork journey, often there will be like a finger might start twitching, or there might be like a spasm in the foot or the leg. And usually those twitches, sometimes shaking, if you then unweight the limb and you kind of increase the sense of safety there, it usually kind of shifts. And the art that I'm sure you're familiar with is learning to allow the body to kind of take over and like trusting the wisdom of the body. So in those moments, I imagine you might have tried something along these lines already, but if you could say, go from the shower, dry off a bit and go lie down in the bed and just like allow your body to do whatever it wants to do. Maybe it's shaking, maybe the shaking then goes to, maybe a feeling starts to arise. But normally at least when I see it in myself, for a while, I just got back from a 2-week meditation retreat, and I had this, my right shoulder started to like twitch, and my neck would kind of like spasm like this. And the more that I sat with it and almost like surrendered into it, the more it softened, and that then led to an emotional release around shame. But it required me to, what we were saying earlier around not like forcing our way in. And the meditation teacher that I had at the time gave a beautiful metaphor. I asked a question about this, and he said, if you had a seed, you wouldn't puncture the seed, you wouldn't use a knife to like break open the seed, but rather you would water it slowly, and it knowing that it would open when it was ready. And I thought that was a really beautiful metaphor. And I think that there were certain times when I felt something, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go into it. I'm going to like break it open. And, sometimes that works. But a lot of the time you need to have this more gentle, like softer approach. So with regards to your question around water, I mean, it could be any number of things. But I think something interesting to experiment with would be to notice when it arises, and then find a quiet, safe space, maybe put on a playlist, weighted blanket, something like that, and just allow your body to do whatever it wants to do. Because that's the thing, like we're not doing this. And this is such a thing that I think took me a long time to really learn. I thought that I had to like do the healing. But really, it's just like we have to get out the way. Like we just have to get the fuck out the way and allow the body and the nervous system to do what it needs to do.
No doubt. Took me a long time to learn that as well. And I think you bring up a really good point where there's like an under emphasis in that kind of relaxation, repatterning phase. Or like think of it as almost like a shavasana for any of these practices, where I noticed that, a lot of times earlier in my somatic journey, I would do a breathwork class or whatever. And then you like lay down for like 30 seconds or a minute, and you're like, okay, cool. I want to like get on. Like I had my big like release, whatever. And more recently, as I've really kind of just like allowed my body to recalibrate after the experience, like give myself like a good 10 plus minutes,
at least,
just laying there and doing nothing and just letting it do what it wants to do. It's like, oh my God, I feel so much better.
Yeah.
And by the way, like all types of somatic experiences come up in that phase, in that experience. And a lot of what I'm seeing being taught is not giving due homage to that part of the experience.
Right. Yeah. Again, such a crucial point. And like that is actually the place where the neuroplasticity and the rewiring takes place. And so in the breathwork journeys that I guide, there's usually about 30 minutes, sometimes more, of the relaxation phase after the peak. And that's like, if that's missed, then it's very unlikely that whatever surfaced is fully completed. And you can actually see in someone's breathing pattern if something, lands. If someone has a cathartic experience, but then like jumps up and, goes into their car like 10 minutes later, it's almost guaranteed that if they came back, that same reflex would need to be moved through because it wouldn't have been fully integrated. And it's just so, I mean, whether it's breath work, whether it's just you have an intense emotional experience, that integration phase where you're literally just lying on your back, like doing nothing, quote unquote, there is so much that's going on there. And like you say, like deeper, richer pieces can arise in that. It's known as it's like a low tone dorsal state where we still feel safe, but we're in that the body is almost asleep, but the mind is still aware. And that's where there's just so much richness there.
You generally advise like 30 minutes after a big experience?
So the journeys that I guide, they follow like the arc of a bell curve. So if it's 90 minutes long, the peak will be about 45 minutes through. And then after 45 minutes, the music will start becoming increasingly more relaxing. And for the last 20 minutes, basically like hands off. It's just purely rest and relaxation.
My personal opinion, because I just know a lot of friends and people that listen to this, like, okay, cool, I'll go listen to a podcast while I do that. It's like,
no,
do
that
nothing.
does not count.
Don't fucking do a podcast. Don't get the brain working, because it's like
interferes.
Even when there's cognition, there's like intense cognition that can interfere with the healing.
You're still in a very altered state in that time. Like that's in some ways, like that's the most, like that's also for me, like where the breakthroughs come through. It's where the insights and the downloads and it's where like the puzzle pieces connect, is in that spaciousness and silence towards the end. It's for me, it's like almost the reason that the previous 45 minutes happened is like for that period.
Yeah.
So if you skip it, you're just like, you're missing out on the best bit, in my opinion.
You've got all the cake ingredients together and you never put it in the oven.
Right.
I know we're kind of coming up on time here, but one thing that excites me is that it seems like lots of mystical figures in history, even, people like channelers, like they all talk about the nervous system, and they all talk about it as effectively the gateway to, call it like, new human capacities, whether those are things like being able to be clairvoyant, as an example, or telekinesis, or any of these other things. And I would just be curious, like, have you read similar things? Like, do you have opinions on like the nervous system being kind of like the pathway to expanded human capacities that maybe a small, very, 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 very small percentage of people experience, but we don't really fully acknowledge as a society yet?
Firstly, I'll say that the experiences that I've had that I'd categorize as mystical or spiritual have mostly come through either breathwork or plant medicine, or in some cases, long-term meditation. I think the interesting connection with the nervous system is, in Kriya or Kundalini meditation, they talk about like being absorbed into your spine. Like they view the central column that goes up the spine, where our spinal cord is, where cerebral spinal fluid gets pumped. Like that is basically like the most sacred place. It's the center of consciousness. And a lot of the work through meditation is bringing like a sense of full absorption into the spine or into around the pineal gland, which again, releases. And so in forms of breath work, you can breathe in a certain pattern such that cerebral spinal fluid gets pumped up the spine and like tickles the pineal gland, and that releases DMT, which creates, very altered states of consciousness and sometimes profound experiences. Yeah, interesting. So my sense is that our dysregulation, that those like knots or fists in our nervous systems are what get in the way of that natural flow of aliveness and energy, which is where some of these more mystical or consciousness expanding gifts come from. And so I think the more clear that we become and the more regulated we become, the more interesting things start to happen. And certainly, like in my experience, the deeper states of meditation and deep absorption. Like I had an experience on this recent meditation retreat. I was just in pure rapture for like a good hour to an hour and a half, like white light, just completely like merging with with the universe. And that wasn't happening in my early meditation retreats. And I think it's reflective of like almost working through some of this gunk that just like we accumulate and build up. So in terms of how the nervous system relates to this, I mean, also for me, the nervous system is where our aliveness and our life force comes from. And the more that we can become attuned to that and learn to cultivate it and also play with our awareness and attention, whether it's expanding our awareness, like right now I'm aware of the room around me, but my attention might be on you and on this conversation. And the more that we can become familiar in this territory, I think the more that these interesting experiences start to open up. And I don't have a formula for that. And it's still a big mystery, a lot of this for me. It feels like the two are so connected in ways that we're just beginning to figure out.
Yeah, look, I agree with you. my kind of wisdom teaching thesis is that there's non-duality, enlightenment, like whatever name you want to call some of these kind of more expansive ways of being is it not a process of adding, but a process of removing that which already is, which always was. And it is the unfortunate disposition of humans by merely existing that we accumulate all this gunk. But, you know, what an opportunity, an amazing place to be to have the awareness and understanding that it actually, there's something you can do about it and to return to a more stabilized experience of wonder and awe and joy and love and bliss and all those things that I think it's the birthright of every human to embody. It's my hope that everybody gets that, man. I think that's a good note for us to wrap up on. I did want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more for people that want to get serious about this. Like, you know, I started to look a little bit at the nervous system mastery material, and I'm going to be honest, I'm going to spend a weekend on it. Like, I'm going to go all in on this stuff, and I want to give you an opportunity to just tell a little bit more to everyone listening about kind of what you're up to, and for people that are serious about this, what they can do about it.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, I actually just opened the applications today for the next cohort that's running in April, starting on April the 10th. It's basically my attempt to try and distill the last 5.5 years or so of learning about this stuff and sharing the particular practices and protocols which I found to be most helpful. And the way the curriculum is structured is we begin with somatic awareness and interoception, and basically, you know, building that sense of what the fuck's going on internally, and then going through self-regulation practices. So things like breathing for up or down regulation. And then the third piece, which is really what we've been talking about in this conversation, is emotional fluidity. It's like, how do we begin to feel and welcome the full spectrum of human emotions, and as a result, feel more free and be able to live more intentionally. And I think that's one of the key pieces for me, is that we often get hijacked into reactivity when these triggers or these patterns arise, and we do things that we regret. And the more that we're able to build this awareness and to go through do the emotional labor, essentially, the more that we're able to live more intentionally and ultimately be more free. And so that's the goal of the training that I'm doing. There's an amazing community that's kind of forming around it. And yeah, I love it. Like, I feel like I learn so much from every cohort, and it's always improving every time. So if you got to the end of this conversation, it probably is a good fit, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. I love it, dude. There needs to be like 100,000 Johnnies out there teaching people about this. And
that sounds terrifying.
You're doing a service to the world, man, by doing what you're doing. And your passion is so evident and so authentic. And I just have deep appreciation for it. And for you, man, it's fucking awesome. I guess that's it. I guess that's the show, everybody. And we're really grateful for everybody that kind of hung out with us today. And if you want to find out more about nervous system mastery, I'll link it. Jonny, and you're also awesome to follow on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
It's Jonny Miller, and the I is with a 1. But yeah, come hang out on Twitter, say hi, ask questions. Definitely love chatting on there as well.
Thanks everybody for listening. This was really fun. We got lots of love for you guys. And if you like this show, give it a review, share it with a friend, do whatever you want. We're just grateful. And we'll see everybody on the next episode.